In our quest to understand what life looks like after the Kabuki deadlift bar, the first thing we have to do is recognize it's the problem. We stop using it. But what does that look like, right? Say we get everybody on board, say, hey, stop using the bar, right? And what does that look like, right? Well, we have two possible options. One being one I've actually talked about today on Instagram, which was a possible migration, this is a very big effort. It's something that's been probably overdue for a long time, which is a migration of weight classes in untested powerlifting. This is something that the IPF did about 15 years ago, if not a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but they definitely did it, over a decade ago, which is they migrated their weight classes and separated themselves from the rest of the sport, which was a bold move on their thing, but they had the audacity to do it, right? Just this year, the USAPL created additional weight classes to produce better competition and a choice for their lifters. So when it comes to creating and changing weight classes, this isn't a foreign concept. It's a great concept, and it's a great alternative to really, really adapt the sport. And it's something that I feel like untested powerlifting is probably sorely overdue for, regardless of this situation with the Kabuki deadlift bar. This just happens to be fortunate timing as a tool or possible tool in the arsenal to combat this, right? There's no lie that the average lifter is much different than what it was 30, 40 years ago, right? When some of these weight classes existed, in their prime and stuff like that. And even now, they've kind of gone so crazy and kind of pushed the limits of things. A shuffle of sorts could probably do the sport, or at least untested, probably pretty well, right? And what would you do if you really kind of created that? And we'll get into that in a second. But the other possible alternative that you would have to solving, which just doesn't really solve the problem, this just kind of weathers the storm, right? Is one, we recognize that the Kabuki deadlift bar is the problem, right? We agree to stop using it, like I said, but we take measures to ensure that it's never allowed to be used ever again. Which just is going to require a stance from open powerlifting to essentially say, hey, any meet using a Kabuki deadlift bar will not be counted on open powerlifting, right? It has to come from open powerlifting. Whether you love open powerlifting or not and think they are a problem, or you think that they're a great resource, they have to take a hardline stance on this, right? And there has to be acceptance, because at the end of the day, they're in this conversation whether they even like it or not. And so when it comes to this, and when you sit there and say, well, they're an unbiased resource, no, they're not. Because if you know your history, they prevented the SPF for a time to actually be posted on open powerlifting. And there is drama from time to time about getting things posted on open powerlifting due to credibility reasons. We take a hardline stance, and we expect, in this type of case, we look at open powerlifting and say, hey, we expect you to take a hardline stance that any meat using Kabuki deadlift bar has to be dealt with as not credible, or not to be added to the database, or added to the unlimited category, or something to that effect. Either way, it's not saturating the database with additional problems, right? Additional crappy world records that are inflating because of the bar, right? And you can make the argument that, high squats get passed, but that's just one at a time. Entire meets of people using this bar, it starts to kind of create a lot of false positives, especially over the last 3 years or how long we've been using it. It's been used and it's created a lot of problems, and you can't just sweep that 3 years under the rug. You can migrate away from it, or we can weather the storm and say, get stronger. But that's not enough. We can't just say, get stronger, overcome it. We have to say, get stronger, overcome it, but rest assured, no one else will ever set a record on it ever again, because we won't accept it. So the community has to take a hardline stance to say, we won't accept it anymore. Again, we'll stand on business, we'll say it with our chest, and we'll call bullshit bullshit. We catch someone trying to set an all-time world record with a Kabuki deadlift bar, sorry, your record won't go up on open powerlifting, or your number won't go up there. You can have it in your heart, it just won't get up where you want it to be. And I think that's a reasonable ask for open powerlifting, to take that stance with the community, should the community, deem it so. Right? You have the USPA taking a stance against it. You have PLU taking a stance against it. I know ABS has a stance against it. So really the only credible in vogue feds who have a stance for it, and I'm pretty sure USPC doesn't even use it. They don't even allow it. So I don't even see how open powerlifting can't take a stance and say, hey, any meets using the Kabuki deadlift bar from here on out, we're just not going to accept that meet in our records database. I think that's the play if we cannot achieve a migration, which the migration, go down this path, is to come up. I created an Instagram story today about like a draft of like potential weight classes that could be out there based on the IPF weight classes, based upon the USAPL weight classes, and and some information from open powerlifting just on possible competitive weight classes that would really kind of condense untested powerlifting and create some real competition, and really kind of in a weird way create a arms race for these new records and these new weight classes, but at the same time create real competition for them, but also at the same time reduce cutting potential, right? Have someone, competing at 231 and the next class up is 264. You're not having people cut from 255 all the way down to 231 and expect to have a good day, right? 205 to 231, just like the IPF classes, you really do kind of put that a little bit more out of reach, and you start encouraging less cuts and more people walking into weight classes or coming into weight classes, right? But you start promoting better competition. But on top of that, that would be on the men's side, but on the women's side is to go ahead and then take the next iteration of untested women's weight classes, right? And really take a really hard look at giving them their fair share of competition, right? When the women's weight classes got extended to new things, that was a step in the right direction, but it was not the right step. It wasn't the complete 100% best step possible, right? Women's powerlifting really deserved like their weight classes that represented them, because it was just normalized to men's weight classes, and that's not always the play, right? Women are not as big as men. They can be, but they're not. A 300-pound woman is much different looking than a 300-pound man. It really is. I mean, a 181-pound woman is definitely much different than a 181-pound man. And the competition is much different. And, the capabilities are much different. And the spread of things are much different. The 198 women are just as strong. If you look at the stats, the 198 women are just as strong as the super heavyweight women. The 181 women are just as strong. They're within 5%, whereas with with men, you know, there's a little bit bigger disparity. You know, a 2,500 pound total, you know, for men at super heavyweight, like when you have 2,300 pound totals and stuff like that at, you know, 2,400, like lower 2,400 pound totals and stuff with certain cases and stuff, it falls off dramatically. But either way, like the spread becomes a little bit different. So having more representative weight class that really tailored to females is probably the best thing for competition, for sport, for everything, right? It's just a fair shake. It's not lazy. And it's an opportunity for us to kind of look at that, right? So without going too far into that, maybe I make a video about that, maybe I don't, but like, because I don't want to drown out the other option, but that's kind of what it creates. You know, it creates a little bit of a state of the union. What do we change? You know, what can we change? And in that turn, it in a way sweeps the records, sweeps the Kabuki deadlift bar era under the rug. But it really is kind of a hard reset for untested powerlifting, where it really does need a kind of a hard reset right now. The records database right now is like, there's a lot of records that are simply just not credible, right? There are a lot of great records that are out there. It's like beat them with credit, you know, stuff like that. But I think that the modern untested powerlifter and the modern powerlifter is a much different person these days, right? They're a much different size and shape. You know, in the NFL, the, you know, linebacker of 1970 is much different than the linebacker of 2024. You know, the running back of 1985 is much different than the one of 2024. Receivers, you name it, right? The tennis player, you know, baseball players, they become different. You know, we adapt and we evolve, right? And I think powerlifting is no different. You know, the 220-year of today is probably, you know, sitting, you know, closer to 250. So, you know, 231 makes a lot of sense. So, you know, when you look at both of these options, and the weight class migration would require a lot of cooperation. It would require cooperation from Open Powerlifting, cooperation from the USPA, cooperation for, you know, universally across, you know, the world to a degree. And it would require a lot of effort. But I think it could be spearheaded here in the United States by the USPA, PLU, and USPC if they were to choose to adopt. I think if those three would choose to adopt it, I think everyone else is kind of windfalls in the line, right? But that's a lot of wishful thinking. However, the second option really does feel like it's probably the more likely, as long as it, you know, these feds have to go to bat and have to really reach out to Open Powerlifting, and people really need to advocate, say, hey, we don't want this bar as a credible thing anymore. Like, we want to move away from it. And we have to kind of take a stance on that. And we have to say, okay, you guys need to take a stance, and we need you to like back us up on this. And I need you to say, hey, any meets coming out with this, like, it needs to not count, right? And federations can't really do that. It's got to come from the people. It's got to come from the masses, say, hey, this shouldn't count anymore. Like, it's just ruining the sport. And I don't know if like that's something that the ego of untested powerlifting is ready to do. So we're kind of in a weird position, but we'll continue to talk about it. These are two options that I really kind of thought of in the top of my head. I think these are really two of the more likely of solutions. They're hard. They're both very difficult solutions. One's really a solution. One's sweeping it under the rug. One's really not a solution. It's just a hardline stance. But yeah, thanks for listening. More to come. It won't always be like this, but I just feel like ranting lately. So have a good night.